It has been a little while since I've done a book. Today we're talking about a good book. I enjoyed it, and a book that is, I don't know, extremely applicable to everything that's happening right now. It is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. I found this. I feel like I need to disclaim that because of everything that's happening. Like, I got this before. I did get this, late 2019. Just sitting on the bookstore shelf at the Bookman locally, and it looked interesting, so I grabbed it. Honestly, I looked at it, I was like, what do you mean you're not talking to white people about race? And I thought, well, that means I probably need to read it. So I did. Today we're going to talk about it a bit. So buckle up. Let me say off the bat, I'm not going to review this book. I don't think that I've read enough about this, about racial tension, racial issues. I've read Words Have a Past, and I don't know, a number of months ago, which is about how newspapers in residential schools with First Nations and how the language was used to, I guess, against First Nations and for colonial values. I read The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, another one. What's the other one I read? I don't remember right now. I read another one recently by Thomas King. I had a red cover. I talked about it. I'll put a title somewhere for you. And so I've got 3-4 books now, kind of in this vein. But what I'm going to talk about today is what it made me think. What it made me think about how I'm going to move forward, and just kind of, how it made me think. One thing I'm going to try to do throughout this discussion on the book is I'm going to stick with her language, which was people of color. She used it to mean anyone that wasn't white. I'm going to try to do that, and most of it, just to stick with what she said. One of the big ideas that stuck out to me was that race is a white person problem. So racism is a white person problem. That white people are racist, or white people benefit from the status quo. And yet, while race is a white person problem, it falls to black people to educate white people, to make all the change, because the white people aren't going to, because white people are not. It falls to people of color. When I said black people, I'm already falling into other language I don't want to use right now. But so black people have to educate, right? It also talked about feminists being the same thing, right? Women had to educate men about feminism, about misogyny, and that white people and men, don't take it on themselves to do the work, right? They say, hey, please educate me, or you need to educate me, which in my mind, when I thought about that, is really stealing value and time from people of color, from women, if we're talking about feminism, people who have less time to themselves, really often. Right? A white man is more likely to be absolved of child rearing duties and other stuff that lots of other people have to do. And so this white man is saying, hey, you need to educate me because I don't have the time for it, or I'm not willing to put the investment in. And it's stealing. That's one of the reasons I'm reading this book. I had this idea a little bit before, specifically with feminism. So I knew, I'm not saying, oh, so educate me. I'm saying, well, what do I read, or how can I be educated? What can I read? I have a whole list of books on race that I'm trying to work through. I've got a couple more coming in. I just bought one from Ibram X. I forget. Let me get it. Hang on. All right. That one. Just picked up this week, sitting at my bookstore. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, I think we'll say it. Because really, it's on me to educate myself. And the problem is it's a problem that white people, myself, are perpetuating, and we're not paying. We're not suffering the consequences, and yet we want other people to show us where we err in our ways, and that's not cool. Another interesting idea that tied into Words Have a Past was the power of language and the power of news, about who makes the news cycle. So she talks about in Britain, because that's where she's from. In Britain, I'm trying to see if there's a year. I don't have her year written down, but there was always street crime in Britain. But then at a certain point, it changed and became mugging to indicate that it was a black people doing this, that it was a black problem, that black people were mugging people. And that's partially because when you look around the newsroom faces, they're white people. So white people set the agenda, and the black people are catering, they're doing stuff like that, and they're not setting the agenda. That was very prevalent in Words Have a Past as well, that The language used in the newspapers was, I think they called it firsting and lasting. So basically it said like anything that Indigenous people, First Nations, Native Americans, depending on where you are, were doing was old, right? It's the old ways that's like fading away and not good. And colonial's all the new things. And they like white people, white schoolmasters in that instance set the agenda for the language and thus set the news, set what was a priority. And so we can get out of this in our news cycles by making sure that we have like, proper representation of race in our newsrooms instead of just mostly white people. Another thing she hit on was white privilege, and she was, I want to say careful, I'm not sure if that's the right word though, but she disclaimed, and we'll say this here, I'll read a quote from the book. It says, "When I talk about white privilege, I don't mean that white people have it easy, that they've never struggled, or that they've never lived in poverty. But white privilege is the fact that if you're white, your race will almost certainly positively impact your life's trajectory in some way." You can find that on page, bring up my note. It's not coming up. 87. And that made me think too, like, just about like I don't worry when I walk down the street and see a police officer. I say, "Hey, how's it going?" Right? I just smile and wave and keep going on. And that's not the case for many people of color. For a lot of people of color, right? I think most specifically Black people. And if I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know about that. But I just don't worry about it, right? I say, "Hey, how's it going?" I don't, if I see a police officer and they're coming over to ask me, I just stand right up and say, "Hey, how's it going?" And talk right up, tell them what I'm doing, talk to them, no problems at all, right? My landlord is a police officer, friend of mine for a long time. I just don't worry about it. So my race, people assume that I'm doing a good thing, that I'm not going in to steal something. That's it. Whereas people of color, that's not the assumption you get. It was nice because I think a lot of the people think, and even myself sometimes would think like, I did grow up in a middle class house. My parents were both around. I had two brothers. We had a pretty easy life, but that doesn't mean that things weren't hard, right? I'm suffered from depression. I seem to remember not having my dad around a lot until we didn't get along at all until my early 20s. Right, even here, I think I live in a nice house. I have room for an office. This is like my office. I'm looking at the car through the garage, but this is my office. And I have that space. I have the space, I can afford a babysitter, all these other things. And I have lots of advantages. And I still think oh yeah, but you weren't here for those 3 or 4 years when I barely made enough money to make ends meet, where I went from a 6-figure business to just dried up overnight. And I had really struggled. We didn't know how we were going to feed our kids. And so it was nice to hear in some ways. I'm not saying you didn't struggle, but that your race was advantage to you, right? So I was more likely to get hired for jobs. I was more likely to, all these other things, that I was more likely to get leeway because I was white. The interesting thing she said about racism and homophobia actually was that there was an old saying that she's aware of, I had never heard it before, that the straight man's homophobia is because he's afraid that other men are going to treat him the way he treats women, which I looked at that and I thought, that's it's just a really good, it seemed like a good analogy to me. And I thought am I afraid that, or are people racist because they're afraid that they are going to be treated the way that they treat people of color? It just made me think again more about that point, is racism happening because they're afraid, people know that they might be treated like the way they treat Black people. And so they do want to make sure that doesn't happen. That's it. That's all I got. This was an interesting book to read. I would say some of the other books I've read were tougher. I think The Words Have a Past was tougher, kind of sitting more in my country. It's had a lot of stuff to think about too, though. So I think I'm going to recommend the book. I do recommend the book. You should read the book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. I hope I said her name right. Because it was a good book. It certainly expanded my thinking on the topic, and I hope it expands yours too. If you liked the video, thumbs up. If you loved it, subscribe, hit the bell. And if you really liked it, you can go to, I was going to say VBS, but that's not it. That's the thing my kids are doing during the day. You can go to patreon.com/CurtisMcHale, where you can sign up and support the channel to help keep stuff coming. So I can buy books, and so that you keep getting content. Have a good day.